Okay, we're going to continue our lesson on the production possibilities curve. The last time we talked about where these points came from. These are points that might be along our hypothetical production possibilities curve. If this economic system is using all of its resources and using those resources efficiently, it can produce consumer goods and environmental goods and services in various combinations. What we're going to do now is talk a little bit more about the math behind it. So in particular, we could ask the question, how can we describe the mathematical relationship between the x and the y variables? So on our y-axis, we have consumer goods, and on our x-axis, we have environmental goods and services. And the general relationship between these two, from a math standpoint, is that the relationship is negative. Of course, we're referring here to the slope of the line that represents this relationship. The red dotted line that I drew in is a linear line that has a constant slope, so no matter where I measure the slope, rise over run, I'm going to get the same exact number, or the same exact trade-off. So this negative relationship fits the definition of economics pretty well, in that we have scarce resources, unlimited wants, desires, and needs, or in this case, two wants, desires, and needs, which means that we have to make a decision about which one, and so it's a choice, and that choice has a trade-off, a cost. So if I want to increase and go up along the y-axis, the only way to do that is to decrease and move in along the x-axis, and vice versa. So the x and the y variable are negatively related, they're inversely related. But if we look at the blue line that's connecting our points on our production possibilities curve, we can see that that line is not a straight line. It's a nonlinear line with a changing slope. And so we need to also talk a little bit about how the slope is changing. So if we look at a measurement of the slope up here near point A, and we drew a tangent line, which is a linear line that's just touching the curve at one point, so that we can actually take the slope of the linear line, we can see that the slope of that line that we just drew in is pretty flat, or it's going to have a fairly low number calculated slope. If we look over here near point E, let's say a point like this, we can see that the slope is going to be pretty steep, and that's going to have a high number. So what's going on here is that the slope mathematically is actually increasing. Or to translate that into more of an economic interpretation, the rate of change between consumer goods and environmental goods and services is increasing. Or as we move in one direction more and more, we have to move away from the other direction more and more. That's that increasing rate of change. So we can kind of see that in our graph. So we could say that the relationship here is negative and increasing. And of course, this is an important concept in economics. Again, just to review here, how does this graphical model define economics? Well, scarce resources, which is represented by the fact that I cannot produce anywhere outside of the production possibilities curve, like a point like X, because I've only got resources that allow me to get to the points on the blue line. That's the scarce resources part of the definition, and the unlimited wants, desires, and needs, and the fact that I have to make a choice is represented by the negative relationship between the x and the y variable. And as we just discussed, by defining the sort of mathematical property of the concept of increasing rate of change, what we can say is what's happening as more resources are shifted into the production of more consumer goods is that we can see that as we move from, for example, E up to B, we're going to have to see an increase in the amount of environmental goods and services that would have to be given up going in this direction towards the origin in order to increase the amount of consumer goods going up along the y-axis. And this is a very important economic concept. To explain this concept maybe in a little bit more detail, we can take a look at some of these points, and I've put in some numbers into the production possibilities curve in order to give this story some context. So we could say that, let's imagine that the economic system is at point E. So we're producing a fairly large number of environmental goods and services and a fairly small number of consumer goods and services. If this country decides that it wants to increase the amount of consumer goods and thus has to give up some environmental goods and services, we can see here that by just giving up 5 units of environmental goods and services, this country can actually gain 30 units of consumer goods. So that gives you the relative price or trade-off between the two. Only have to give up 5 to get 30. But notice that once we get to C, and now we're actually producing fewer environmental goods and services to begin with, giving up 5 actually only yields the country 10 units of consumer goods and services. So the cost has gone up. And we can see that here in the 2 bullets if we break that down into a little bit more detail. And as a result, we can say that between points E and D, 1 unit of consumer goods costs about 1/6 of a unit of environmental goods and services, and between points C and B, 1 unit of consumer goods costs 1/2 of a unit of environmental goods and services. So we can see that the cost is actually rising. We could do this same thing, of course, in the other direction, and talk about increasing environmental goods and services. And of course, if we did that, we'd have to decrease consumer goods. We can talk about the increase in cost going in the other direction. So this concept is called the law of increasing opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of producing a good increases as more resources are shifted into its production. And by definition alone, there's really not much going on here, so I think it usually helps when you're teaching this lesson to have a couple of stories or examples to talk about to try to put this into some context. So let's go back to our graph. So here's our graph again, and in this graph I've added a couple of additional labels. So to explain this production possibilities curve, law of increasing cost idea, the one way we do this is sort of to set up a little scenario. Let's suppose that the country is currently operating at point B. Point B is a fairly equal split of resources between producing environmental goods and services and consumer goods and services. And what we're also going to suppose is we're going to suppose that with our resources of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability, entrepreneurial skill, that given we have all these resources at our disposal and they're all being used to produce both consumer goods and environmental goods, what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's suppose that consumer goods happen to use labor a little bit more intensively, a little bit more productively, so that a lot of the labor, not all of it, is over there producing consumer goods. And contrast that with environmental goods and services. Let's assume that environmental goods and services are capital intensive. They use a lot of equipment and machinery. Again, capital is being used in consumer goods and labor is being used in environmental goods, but what we're going to say is that these resources are used a little bit more productively, a little bit more intensively. And that makes sense. I mean, we're going to allocate our resources to what they do best or what's most productive. And so we would imagine that some resources are going to be really good at producing one or the other goods, and that's where we would expect them to be when we're at an efficient state on the production possibilities frontier. So if we make these assumptions and then suggest that the country feels as though it would like to increase the amount of environmental goods and services by 5 and move from points B to point C, what has to happen? Well, we know that to increase environmental goods and services by 5, it has to give up 10 units of consumer goods and services. But what's really happening is that the nation has to give up the resources that were being used to produce those 10 units of consumer goods and move those resources over into the production of environmental goods and services. Well, what we can do is we can take resources from producing labor-intensive consumer goods that are more productive at producing environmental goods and services than other resources. So we're going to take the resources that are best at producing environmental goods, the ones that are easiest to transform into producing environmental goods and services. So therefore, the move from B to C doesn't come at that significant of a cost for the economic system. We're only going to lose 10 units of consumer goods. But if we're at point D, and we kind of continue this story and say, well, what if we're at point D and we decide to increase environmental goods and services by 5? Well, now we're way down here at point D. We're producing fewer and fewer consumer goods to begin with, which means we've moved even more resources into the production of environmental goods and services. And once we get done using and taking the resources that are pretty good at producing environmental goods and services, we have to take the resources that aren't so good or less productive. And as we continue to take less and less productive resources away, we're going to find that the cost is going to rise.